continue. Thank you. Richard, can you hear me?
Yes, Teacher, I can hear you. I don't know if everyone is getting me.
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Ah, ok. Merci beaucoup, mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. C'est pour nous un grand plaisir de nous réunir encore une fois dans ce cadre de l'Union panafricaine des avocats, PALU, dans notre commission sur l'environnement, pour essayer de réfléchir sur un grand thème ayant trait au bilan du deuxième sommet africain sur le climat. D'aucuns savent que
Climate. So
les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, et
head
même
of
certains
states
ministres
and
se sont
government
réunis à
and
Addis Abeba
even
il y a
some ministers
peu
gathered in
pour
Addis Abeba a
réfléchir
couple of
autour des
days
questions
ago in order to reflect
relatives au
around
changement climatique
about on issues
et
rather
surtout comment
uh,
l'Afrique est en train de subir par
related to
rapport
climate
à
change
l'injustice
and
du
what
monde
Africa
occidental,
is
en
suffering from,
particulier des grands
especially
collègues,
coming
même du
from
monde oriental.
great polluants like
Mais l'Afrique
Western
jusque-là est
countries.
en train
Africa, till
de se
date,
nourrir.
is
L'Afrique meurt à petit feu, subit
dying,
les fouets
if I may
des
say
changements
it
climatiques.
like that,
Alors,
because of
les chefs de
the nefarious
gouvernement et même
effects
les
of the
ministres
climate change. So,
sectoriels se sont
heads of
retrouvés
governments and
à Addis Abeba pour
ministers
réfléchir
gathered
autour de
in
ces questions.
Addis Ababa in order to
Il y a
reflect
des
on
autres
that
options qui
issue,
ont été
and important
prises
resolutions
pour
were also
essayer
taken
d'éviter non
during
seulement
that
contre les
meeting in
changements
order to
climatiques, mais
fight
encore pour
against
voir
climate
comment
change on one hand,
l'Afrique
but
peut
also on the other hand
mettre
to see
sur
how
pied des
Africa
mécanismes
can
pour
implement
essayer de
some
faire face
mechanisms in order to
aux
face
défis liés
the
au
various
changement climatique.
challenges
Voilà
related to
pourquoi,
climate
dans le
change.
cadre de ce
This is the
webinaire,
reason why,
nous
within the
avons
framework of
des
this
éminents
webinar,
orateurs, des experts en
we will
matière,
have
avec qui on va
experts
réfléchir sur le bilan
with
du
whom
deuxième
we are going
sommet
to reflect on
africain sur le
the second
climat, parce que
summit,
le premier, il y en avait eu,
African Summit on
qui
Climate,
vont
because the
accélérer
first one,
avec leur cogitation
I
des
mean,
résultats du
during their
premier sommet
consultations, they
par
took
rapport à comment
into
ça a
account
été
the
implémenté
resolutions of the
et
first
ce qui a
summit.
été
They
encore
tried to
résolu
saw
au deuxième
how
sommet.
these
Nous allons
resolutions were implemented,
voir
and
comment on va
in this second
procéder.
in the
Voilà,
second
après
summit,
cette
we are going to see
brève
how to proceed. So,
introduction, nous allons
this being
devoir
said,
vous présenter
I am going now to
sommairement nos éminents
make a
intervenants
brief
ou nos
presentation
panélistes.
of
Nous
our
avons
panelists. We have
Madame Ratch.
Madame Arch.
Elle a bien préféré qu'on l'appelle Madame
She
Ratch
likes
parce
we
que je
us to
sais,
call her Madame Rash.
je m'interdis de massacrer son nom par
I
rapport
don't
à la
want
prononciation.
to mispronounce her name.
Madame
So it's
Ratnish
Madame
Bruni.
Radnish
Comprenez
Bruli.
qu'il n'a
So
pas de la peine que je la présente comme Madame Ratch.
I really need
Et
to take my
Madame Ratch
time
est une
to present
ingénieure
her as Madame
de
Rash.
la
She's
démocratie.
from Kenya.
Et
She's a
puis,
lawyer.
Global Gaze Campaign Manager.
She's a global risk
Donc,
campaign
elle est
manager. So
responsable de cette
she is
campagne-là.
in charge of
Elle est
that
aussi avocate.
company, and she is also, as I said,
Elle a une
lawyer
grande
in Kenya.
expérience dans
Uh,
l'énergie
she's an expert in terms of
renouvelable et même dans le
renewable
sourcing
energy and
culturel. Elle a
natural
vraiment
resources,
l'expertise là-bas
and
et va nous édifier
she is going
sur
to enlighten us
les
about
résultats.
the results.
Les résultats, oui, les résultats du sommet, du sommet
about the outcomes
sommet
of
africain,
the
deuxième sommet, bien
African
sûr,
Summit, the second African
sur
Summit
puis
on
comparer
climate
les
compared with
résultats du
the
premier sommet,
outcomes of the first
comment on
one.
peut accéder
How can
aux
we
finances et surtout comment
have
réaliser
access to
la
finance,
transition
and how
écologique.
can
Donc,
we
les analyses ont
implement
très bien été faites
ecological
là. Ça, c'est
transformation?
Madame
So
Raj qui est déjà
this
là et
is
des
the
amis.
task of Madame
Je
Raj.
vais
She's
rendre
already
l'antenne à
here.
Madame
Welcome
Raj.
to you, Madame Raj.
Vraiment,
Merci beaucoup, Richard. Thanks, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon from wherever we are joining. Just a point of correction. I think it would be unfair to the lawyers in the room, like June Cynthia, to call myself a lawyer. I've only done legal practice, but I'm a public policy analyst, so my work is more around policy work. Nonetheless, thank you so much for your question, and I think you very well already talked about. You did a very small stock take from what we call the Nairobi to Addis journey, from Africa Climate Summit one that happened in my very city of Nairobi, to Addis, where we've seen quite a lot of difference in terms of what happened, who was involved, and what are some of the key outcomes. And I think the one thing I will definitely say is, from Nairobi to Addis. In Nairobi, we had the voices of Africans unified, but now when you bring it to Addis, it's that voice that has translated into tangible financing for the continent. Where, if you look at what we don't have an official declaration as yet, because there were a couple of countries that weren't very happy with what the final wording was, but we do have a draft version of what looked like the final outcome. And what was big, what stood out for me personally was issues around just transition and where the financing for that will come from. And just to take us back a little, I mean, we need to obviously look at where we currently stand and how from here then we can talk about, how ACS2, what came out of it, and probably the journey now from Addis to what I'll call, is Belém, as we're thinking about COP30 and the demands from Africa. So the first thing is we need to know, where the continent is. And I think for me, statistics always...
Madame Raj, merci beaucoup. Nous allons vous donner
Madame
la
Raj,
parole. Reste juste la présentation
so
sommaire.
it's
Vous
just
allez
the
entrer en détail dans les
presentation. You are
moments
going
intéressants.
to get into the details in a couple of minutes, please.
Okay, that's okay.
D'accord. Et nous avons encore un autre panéliste.
Okay, so we still
Dr.
have another
Ahmad
panelist, Dr. Ahmad
Lui,
Abdallah.
il vient de l'Égypte.
He is from Egypt.
Il est chairperson of the
He is the chairperson
Egyptian Commission for Rights and de la Commission égyptienne des droits et libertés.
so the Egypt Commission of
Il a aussi une
Rights and
expertise
Unity. So he is an
en
expert,
la matière. Je crois, nous lui donnons aussi la parole de
and
s'exprimer sommairement
we will also
pour ne
give him the
pas
floor for a brief
s'attarder trop
presentation.
sur lui. Dr. Ahmad, une
Dr.
présentation
Hamad,
sommaire et on
a
peut
brief
suivre.
presentation of yourself, please.
Thanks, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be among you here. If I'm introducing myself, I'm Ahmed. I'm an environmental defender and the human rights defender from Egypt. I'm the chair of the Egyptian Commission for Rights and Freedoms, which is a membership-based human rights organization working on Egypt across several human rights issues, among which is the right to healthy environment. I'm also the chair of Environmental Rights Africa. I will present more of Environmental Rights Africa in detail in my talk, but it's a Pan-African environmental rights coalition from almost all over the continent. Pleased to be among you here, and it's a pleasure to be in this talk. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Ahmad. Là,
Thank you very
nous
much, Dr.
présentons
Ahmed.
ici Madame Anne Tech.
We have
Madame
also with
Anne
us
Tech,
Madame
elle
Antek.
est la coordonnatrice
She's the coordinator
des climate justice
of
and
climate
natural resource
justice and
governance.
natural
Donc,
resource
elle
governance.
est la coordonnatrice d'une structure qui
So
se
she's a
nomme
coordinator of a
la
structure
justice
called
climatique
Climate Justice
et des ressources
and
naturelles
Natural
et la bonne
Resource
gouvernance.
and
Je
Good
vois
Governance.
Madame Antek,
Madam
si
Antek,
elle est là
if you are
et
with
m'entend, elle peut
us and
aussi
if
se
you can
présenter
hear me,
sommairement.
maybe you can introduce yourself shortly.
Thank you, Richard. As introduced, my name is Anne. I'm an activist for climate and environment and biased towards women and the vulnerable groups, and happy to meet you all and looking forward to this session. Thank you, Richard.
Merci beaucoup,
Thank you very
Madame
much,
Anne.
Madam Anne.
Nous avons aussi Monsieur
We have with
Omar
us also Mr.
Al-Mawi. Monsieur
Omar El-Mawi.
Al-Mawi, est-ce qu'il est là avec
Mr. Omar
nous?
El-Mawi, are you
Il
with
peut
us? If
directement
yes,
se présenter
you can
sommairement pour
introduce
gagner du
yourself
temps.
shortly to save
Monsieur
time.
Omar,
Mr.
il est
Omar,
là?
are you with us?
Yeah, I just joined Richard. Unfortunately,
Ah,
sorry, I'm not sure what you've asked.
oui, oui, il va venir. Est-ce que Madame Massi Omoyo,
So,
elle est
Madam
aussi là?
Massi Oyo, are you with us?
Je ne l'ai pas encore vu.
Hi, Richard.
Ok,
I'm
Madame
right
Massi
here.
Omoyo.
Okay,
Yes.
would you like me to introduce myself? Sorry, I think I'm getting lost in translation here.
Oui, oui, sommairement, je sais que vous
Yes,
êtes
you can introduce
aussi
yourself shortly.
activiste
You are also an
environnemental,
activist
vous êtes
for environment.
coordonnatrice
You are coordinator
d'une structure
of a
et
structure
qui regroupe des
and
avocats
the group
qui
of
militent sur la protection de
advocates
l'environnement.
who
Vous pouvez vous
advocate
présenter
for
donc
environment. You can
sommairement.
introduce
Merci.
yourself shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So my name is Nomasango Masiemwe. I'm actually a registered lawyer based in Zimbabwe, and I've got a little bit of history in academia at different university institutions, but now I find myself deeply rooted within the climate justice and environmental space in the civil society industry. I work for an organization called Natural Justice, where I'm the coordinator of the Environmental Lawyers Collective for Africa, which is a collective of environmental lawyers that are really committed to championing environmental justice using strategic litigation. And we provide resources for them and help with capacity building. So that is the perspective within which I am having this discussion today. And pleasure to be here and to engage with your listeners. Back to you, Richard.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank
Je
you very
crois
much.
que ce sont là les
I think
panélistes
that
qui
these
sont
are
déjà
the
là parce que
panelists
je ne vois
who
pas
are
Monsieur
online with
James.
us because I don't
Est-ce
see
que
Mr.
Monsieur
James.
James est là
Mr.
aussi?
James, are you with us?
Et je ne le vois pas.
No, I
S'il
don't
est
see
là,
him.
on peut le présenter
If he's
sommairement.
here,
S'il n'est pas
he
là,
can introduce
nous allons
himself. Otherwise,
aborder
we are going to
les points à l'ordre du
move
jour.
to the agenda.
Nous allons commencer
So we
par
are going to start
demander aux
and ask
panélistes
the panelists,
quelques questions
ask
avant
them a few
qu'ils ne puissent
questions
nous présenter
before giving them the floor
leur
to
speech ou
submit
qu'ils puissent faire
their
leur présentation. Nous
presentations.
allons
So
essayer de réfléchir et ils
we'll
vont nous
try
répondre
to
selon chacun
put our heads together
sur
and then we
ces
try to
points-là.
get their
Alors,
answers.
l'ordre du jour est
So on the
structuré comme
agenda,
suit.
we have the following
Et bien
items.
sûr que oui, nous avons déjà
So we
ouvert
have
notre
already
session par
opened the
en
session
faisant une approche
and
du thème
we
qui nous
have
réunit.
given a
Et nous venons de
brief overview
présenter
of the topic of
brièvement,
today,
bien
and we
entendu, nos
have made brief
panélistes.
introduction of
Au deuxième
panelists.
point de
The
notre
second item on the agenda
session, nous allons voir
is
l'aperçu des résultats
to
du
take
sommet
stock
africain sur
of
l'événement
of the
climat
and have an
résilience.
overview of the African Climate Summit
Et qu'est-ce
outcomes
que
and their
les
significance,
sommets,
and what did
tous
the
ces sommets
summit
ont-ils offert de
deliver?
nouveau par rapport au
What
premier
is
sommet, parce
new
qu'il y a
in
eu
comparison
d'autres
to a
sommets.
previous
Et
summit?
puis, les panélistes
And then the
vont nous
panelists
donner leurs
will
réflexions sur
reflect
les engagements
and
et les
share
déclarations,
with us
même les
their
promesses
opinion
de ces
on
sommets.
declaration
Après,
and pledges
on
made at
va
that
poser
the
quelques
summit.
questions
After
pour
that, We'll ask some questions to get answers within short time limit, and then we will move on to the analysis of the agenda, and to also consider the challenges faced. And this will be included in the presentations of the panelists. After that, we'll have interactive session, questions and answers. So, dear panelists, so what is the overview of the African Climate Summit outcomes and their significance? So, the overview of the second African Summit. So what is your feedback on the outcome, and what is their significance? In other words, what is the outcome of this summit? What is new? So is it Madam Raj who is going to talk first, or Madam Anne, or Madam Masio, Mr. Abdullah, Mr. Omar? So we just have 30 minutes to get your feedback so that we can manage time properly.
I'm happy to begin.
Oui, Monsieur Omar, vous pouvez y aller.
If you'll allow me.
Yes, please go ahead, Mr. Omar.
And apologies, everyone, for joining a bit late. My name is Omar Elmawi. I am an African who is based in Mombasa, in East Africa. And I work as a convener of the Africa Movement of Movements. To begin with, on the Africa Climate Summit and whatever was agreed, I think the first place to begin is to mention that this was the second African Climate Summit. We had the first one in 2023 in Nairobi, and I'll be happy to respond about some of the differences between them. But for me, the declaration that we were able to receive from our African representative was somewhat good and bad, but mostly good one way or another. And I'll be speaking about the many good things that it comes with it, and the few things that we are worried in terms of how the climate discourse is going to look like for the African continent for the next foreseeable future. Now, the good things, I would say it's a declaration that's really very strongly drafted and raises some of the key issues that we want to see for the continent. And I'll speak about some of these issues in brief. So the first thing is, and before going to the specificity of the issues, is that it's clearly highlighted and spoke in detail about some of the key issues that are affecting the continent, including aspects about how the continent doesn't have access to clean cooking. Close to 1 billion people don't have access to clean cooking. It mentioned about the problem of Africa being underdeveloped in terms of over 600 million people not having access to electricity. And therefore, the picture that's being painted here is that therefore our climate agenda and sort of climate action that we want to see for the continent is not necessarily the same way as we're trying to discuss in the other continents. And for this, I mean that while the other continents, the priority will be mitigating in terms of cutting down the carbon molecule itself, in Africa, which is only contributing about 4% of the carbon emissions historically, and less than 0.5% annually. Therefore, mitigation is not necessarily a priority for Africa because it's neither here nor there, because we don't have a carbon mitigation problem. Our agenda should be how do we develop this continent in a way that is climate compatible. So how do we avoid emissions as we develop this continent that is significantly underdeveloped with a lot of potential in it. So you will see it stresses issues like equity. It mentions very clearly actions like climate justice. It talks about key responsibilities like the common but differentiated responsibilities, among others. But now specifically, because we don't have time, first on climate finance, the declaration was very clear that Africa needs about 3 trillion US dollars by 2030. And right now, we're only receiving about US dollar 30 billion. That is the period between 2021 to 2022. It's therefore is demanding on climate finance that it needs to be scaled up. That finance has to be grant-based. You cannot give loans to African countries in the name of climate finance, but actually what you're doing is you're continuing to make these countries be indebted. And in many, many ways, you are affecting them. They're dealing with a problem that they do not necessarily cause. Apologies.
Please, sir. Apologies. Dr. Omar. Mr. Omar. Sorry to interrupt you. We should have a very short intervention because your presentation will follow later, because now it's just an overview of the outcome of the summit on climate. So if you can give the opportunity to others panelists, so it should be brief.
Definitely.
You will go into details later on when you will make your presentation. Thank you for your understanding. I can see Mrs. Raj. Your comment regarding the outcome overview.
Thanks again, Richard. And I think I echo quite a lot of what Omar has already mentioned. And without going into detail, I think one of the key things that picking up just from where Omar has left is finance was definitely, very outstanding in the declaration. That's one. And secondly, renewable energy stood out. I think one of the things he wasn't able to mention, and maybe he'll get into that when he's presenting, is the fact that language on renewable energy is stronger in the second Africa Climate Summit, which is something we are commending. But at the same time, from my position where I sit, and I'm worried about phasing out fossil fuels, the language on fossils has been softened in the new declaration. So that's a concern for the continent, where we're trying to ensure we can industrialize, we're trying to ensure we have access to energy, but the right source of energy, the right source of renewables is what we are trying to push for. And I think language was softened in the second Africa Climate Summit. So this is something we need to ensure we are continuously, especially as activists, continuously pushing back on and saying, we don't need fossils on the continent. Thanks. And I'll probably hand it to anyone else that would like to speak, because I think we can get into the details later.
Oui, je vois
Yes.
votre commentaire aussi.
Thank you
Please,
so much.
Mrs. Moyo.
I think I echo the statements of the two previous speakers. I think it helps to have such a plethora of different expertise on the panel, because you don't have to repeat yourself. But definitely climate finance is something that was a really huge outcome coming out of this specific summit, with Italy committing upwards of 4 billion when it comes to climate finance, as well as Denmark's support for agriculture. We also saw other positive milestones, commitments to agroecology, to smallholder farmers, to the recognition of the role of youth and women, which are really important milestones. But I think I'll speak a little bit more to the pessimistic side of things, since the other speakers weren't able to get there, which is the fact that we need to be honest about some existing gaps. That whilst there were a lot of leaders that were calling for debt cancellation and more grant-based finance instead of these loan structures, I think there was also still a heavy push for carbon markets and offsets and debt swaps. And I think whilst these things may look attractive on paper, they really do risk locking Africa into the same type of exploitative model as the extractive industry, as the fossil fuel-based framework and logic that has basically undermined the sovereignty of a number of different countries on the continent for many, many decades now. And I think even talking about the Africa Green Mineral Strategy, for instance, which is supposedly supposed to be something that's a huge milestone because it gets us talking about critical minerals and putting Africa at the center of a just energy transition, it's important for us to remember that framework and to not replicate it, to not mirror the framework that we've been spending so much time, at least in civil society sectors, to dismantle. I think I can leave it to the next speaker to share their thoughts.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Asiemoyo.
Thank you, Madame Asiemoyo. Madame Antek, do you have any also got your comment? What the summit has as a plus compared to the others?
Oui, Madame Anne, on vous attend pas?
Madame Anne?
Right. Good. I'll go ahead then. Thank you so much, Richard, and the panelists. I mean, I agree with the position of most panelists, but just looking outside the discussions around the climate summit, I think for me, there was a lot of improved organizations from the last summit. I don't say there was no organization in Nairobi, but in terms of badges, I mean, we didn't have very long queues except the first day. We saw a lot of organization in terms of transport. I think Ethiopia is trying to place itself as the next convener of COP, but also we can't forget the politics around the Grand Resonant Dams in Ethiopia. I think that also played a role in terms of attendance by most of heads of states. But also, I mean, it's good to look at the issues of organization of civil society. How was the civil society organized during the SCS? I think those politics also play a lot. But I want to say in terms of the outcome, though we still have a draft declaration, I think it was comprehensive enough, an improvement from the last declaration. But I mean, in terms of issues of gender and vulnerable groups, there's a lot of gaps in that area. Thank you so much. And over to Hamid.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Anne.
Thank you, Madame Anne. Dr. Abdallah.
Thank you so much. I echo what my colleagues have said. I think Africa Climate Summit in Addis, I mean, we have seen improvement in the finance commitments, which is a leap forward from Africa Climate Summit 1, which was strong on vision, but it was thin in finance. I think as well broadened the participation, formally recognizing youth, women, and indigenous groups. So this inclusion matters. But I think, of course, it was. I mean, there has been problem regarding the fossil fuel, and there was softening of the language in the Addis compared to Nairobi, and I guess still there are some implementation gaps at the end of the day. I mean, still environmental defenders remain under threat in lots of African countries. Still, we see a restriction on the civic space in other countries. So I think this needs to be addressed. Sometimes there is lack of environmental information, and this as well needs to be addressed. So still lots of work to be done. But yeah, I think in overall it was positive improvement what happened in Addis. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je crois que
Thank you.
nous avons tous eu
Thank you. I think we already have an overview of the outcomes of this summit. So another question, and this question, each panelist is just going to answer to it in a few seconds. According to you, what was the importance of the outcomes of the second summit compared to the first one? The importance of the outcomes, and that's your opinion that I'm asking for, compared to the first one. the importance of the outcomes of the second summit compared to the first one, just in few seconds. So we ended by Dr. Ahmad Abdallah. Dr. Ahmad Abdallah, what's your take regarding the importance of this summit?
Well, I think the summit is an important event. I mean, Africans at the end of the day, it's a place that we all share our experiences, and we all lobby for the common causes. So, I've always been in favor of the climate summit, but at the end of the day, like I told you, there has been some improvements regarding the rights language, the finance commitments. But still, we had huge problems regarding fossil fuel, and you have some states which championed the fossil fuel expansion as energy access. Which is like I tell you, it's an argument that we don't buy. I mean, at the end of the day, lots of African countries export billions of dollars in fossil fuel since the beginning of the 2000s, and yet the access to electricity for ordinary Africans, it only grew marginally, and we still 600 million Africans still lack electricity. Most of them are in countries which is rich in oil and gas. So while in other cases we have seen that small scale renewables, whenever they are invested, the results are transformative, and we have examples in Rwanda and Burkina Faso. So yeah, this is my my outcome, my takeaway from the summit. Thank you.
Ah, ok, merci beaucoup. Là, compte tenu du temps,
Thank you.
nous passons
So
directement la
since
parole
we
à
don't have
Madame Raj.
enough time, we are going
Elle
to give the
continue
floor
avec sa
to Madame
présentation
Raj. She's going
pour
also
gagner
to
le temps
make
parce
her
qu'il y a
presentation
d'autres
in order for us to save
membres.
time because we are running out of
Voilà,
time.
parce que
So Madame
je sais que
Raj,
chacun de vous
I know
a son point de vue
everyone
par rapport à
has
l'importance
his own point of view regarding
des résultats de la
the
deuxième sommet
importance of the outcomes of the second summit compared to the first one. But since we are running out of time, we are
au
going
vif.
immediately to give the floor
Alors, Madame Raj,
to
vous
Madame
avez
Raj.
la
Madame
parole
Raj, you
pour
have the floor
votre
uh, for
présentation.
your
Bien
presentation,
sûr, vous nous
please.
donnez
And
les
also,
lignes
you
maîtresses, ce qui va
will
valoir, ce qui
give us
permettra de
some
l'on puisse s'exprimer et d'ouvrir
important
le temps
aspects
d'échange
and
pour
in
enrichir
order for us to
davantage
have a bit
ces
some
assises.
time
Merci beaucoup. Vous avez la
to
parole, Madame
exchange
Raj.
at the end. So, Madam Raj, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Richard, once again. And I think Omar had already started, talking a lot about, some of the key issues around finance. And I think that's where I'll start from. The most important element, like I'd said, at the start was the fact that we are talking big numbers. We're talking about tangible finance for the continent, and we're talking about finance for both adaptation and, moving to renewable energy as well as, industrialization for the continent. But that doesn't mean, we don't stock take where we are. We need to know, for us to think about futuristically, you also have to look at, where you are presently. And I think he's already given us, the stark difference in the figures where by 2030 we're supposed to be expecting 3 trillion on the continent, but we're only getting 30 billion. And that means Africa is not, we're barely getting 10% of what actually has been promised or what the continent deserves. Where we are today, we're only getting about 3% of global climate finance, which means majority of this money is coming into our countries with loans. For countries, 23 out of 54 countries, if you're already debt stricken, you're already spending more, of your public funds. Governments are spending more money, on servicing that debt, on making sure you're continuously paying, interest in foreign currencies rather than spending on public goods like, health, education, and any other basic right that, every other African deserves. Then it's when you sit back and look at it, then a summit like the African, Climate Summit should deliver the right kind of finance. It should deliver the numbers that the continent needs. But beyond just the numbers, it has to deliver a plan on how we are actually going to get that money. And I think there was, I mean, in terms of the outcomes of what has happened at Africa Climate Summit too, I must say, at least there's new announcements in terms of African solutions for the continent itself. There's money that is being invested by Pan-Africanists themselves into the continent, which is something we are definitely one for. And secondly, saying we need more of that. Why? Because an Africa Climate Innovation Compact, an African Climate Facility, with an ambition of mobilizing about 50 billion annually for solutions that are on the continent, which means something Anne mentioned, the fact that youth, women, and a lot of differently abled people have not been included in the last couple of years. We're talking about African-led solutions. This, financing has to go to working for them. Another thing that stood out is leaders called for Africa's share of global renewable investment to rise from, which is only 2% today, to about 20% by 2030. So right now, if you're only getting 30 billion to get to 3 trillion by 2030, it means a lot more needs to, a lot more public financing needs to be put into the continent. A lot more adaptation finance needs to get onto the continent to allow our communities, one, to adapt, not just mitigate, the issues around climate change, but a big part of that, and I think that's what we're continuously calling for, even as we are thinking about COP, is this money should come in the form of grants. It should not come in the form of loans. We cannot repeat, what has happened to us, especially from, multilateral finance. We cannot be getting the World Bank or the African Development Bank or, any other sort of multilateral development bank giving us loans for loans for adaptation, loans for investing in renewable energy, yet they know the continent has, all the natural resources. We have to get fairer borrowing terms. There has to be more stronger representation from, the continent in terms of who is negotiating on our behalf, especially when it comes to, what kinds of deals we are signing. Those are the really good outcomes that we're thinking around on the climate finance side. But there is also the issues on, and I think Dr. Ahmed mentioned it, where language was softened around, fossil fuel financing. In the Nairobi Declaration, there was a lot, one, stronger language, and secondly, there was a lot of mention of, we don't want to invest into fossil fuels. And that was probably the same time, as we were getting into COP28, a year, where finance was also, quite big on the agenda. And in Addis, the challenge is, one, the language has been softened, and secondly, from where I sit, I think we're giving the continent a chance to reinvest, or we're opening the doors for the wrong kind of investments. Things like saying, any kinds of technologies or any sources of energy that can be transitional are welcome. That allows us, we're opening the doors for fossil gas, and that is already causing debt in so many other countries, global south countries in Asia. There's no African country that we can actually say is using fossil gas for its domestic consumption. Everything is being exported, so it cannot be an energy source that we're trying to invest into. And lastly, we're trying to say the finance, which wasn't there in the Addis Declaration, was making that finance accessible for women, for youth, for local communities. It's not supposed to be for governments, for state corporations, because currently a lot of our countries have political capture, have state capture, where the citizens don't have the right to question. There's no accountability of any finance that's coming into the countries or where necessarily it's being used. And like my other panelist has mentioned, the women, the youth, the local communities are the ones that are suffering. 600 million people don't have energy, 900 million people don't have access to clean cooking, but we are getting, if we're getting the monies, it's monies in the form of loans. These are the same people that will have to then give away their basic rights of health, basic rights of shelter, basic rights to food, because we are going to start debt financing for most of the investments that come into the continent. One thing that I still remember in one of the panel discussions that I had attended was a very nice quote by His Excellency Ambassador Ali, who is the Special Envoy for Climate Change for Kenya. And he says, the continent needs 4 times the climate change, the climate finance it's currently receiving. For a continent that Kenya has 100%, almost 100% renewable energy. And for us to get to 100% renewable energy for the continent, we could be saving almost 3 to 5 trillion in the next 20 to 30 years, and also creating jobs at the same time. If we're having, the youth bulge in the next maybe 20 years will come from this continent. Those are the laborers of the future, those are the youth of the future. They are the ones that will need to be involved in the jobs of the future. If we are trying to invest, if we're getting money into the continent and we're trying to invest in their futures, then let's do it the right way. Let's ensure, that we are getting investments, one, for the food sector, for the energy sector, that will allow them to ensure, livelihoods, education, and all of this is secured in the future. And I'll just close by saying that scaling renewable energy is more than, just numbers. It's about unlocking the future of a youth that in the next 20 years will probably be the biggest on the globe. And for summits like the Africa Climate Summit, and in the next 1.5 months or in the 1 month we're going to COP, we can't just keep talking about pledges, and doubling adaptation finance or tripling, renewable energy, or getting commitments for green industrialization. We actually have to get the money to start doing it right now, because the investments that you put in right now is what will translate into, livelihoods for communities in the coming years. Thank you. And I hope that sort of, lays the foundation of what everybody else is going to speak about. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Raj.
Thank you, Madame Raj. Thank you for your brilliant presentation. So you finished by a wish to have the funds available in order to finance all, the projects that you talked about. And also, we should not forget the rest of the other aspects, as you mentioned. We have health, we have education, because we cannot focus ourselves on climate change and forget the most important, or the basics. You also mentioned that in the second summit declaration, we didn't take into account people, physically challenged people, and even the gender. So the funding should also be taken into account regarding the challenges that we are also facing. We have the Pan-African investments, in order for Africa to totally depend on its partners, or its regular partners that are most often coming from the West, especially when we talk about the financial aspect related to climate change. So by 2030, we can do that, and this will increase by 2% by 2030. We also need to insist or focus ourselves on sustainable energy, renewable energy. So thank you very much for your presentation. Now we are going to give the floor to Mr. Omar Albawi. Mr. Omar Albawi, you have the floor. Kindly give us your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Definitely first to agree with everything that has been said by Raj and the rest of the colleagues. I think just to be brief, first on climate finance, the only thing I will add is the declaration also was very categorical that the international financial institutions like the World Bank and other multilateral development banks, there's a need for them to be reformed so that African countries can continue getting climate finance, not in a way that is going to impact them and their budgets as they proceed. The other thing is also they talked about an aspect around what is called the CBAM or carbon border adjustment mechanism, which what it means is that for any goods that are being made and going into Europe, there's a carbon tax that's being imposed, and therefore it makes those goods becoming more expensive. And therefore African countries cannot necessarily compete with the markets within this area. So that's also one of the things that it spoke in a very negative term. On energy, definitely the push for 300 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030 was very categorical, especially to cut the electricity access from 600 million people to at least 300 million people getting access, universal access to electricity. And also the close to 1 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking becomes important. They also mentioned on energy that the finance that is available globally for renewable energy, currently Africa only receives about 2%. So they asked for that figure to be multiplied 10 times. So from 2% to 20% of whatever finance is available for renewable energy globally, that 20% should be coming to Africa. On energy as well, it also mentioned that there has to be given a priority for renewable energy. So whenever there's an energy project or resources available, priority should be given to renewable energy, but it still provided a loophole for fossil fuels because it mentions that transition fuels, which normally means gas, will still be acceptable, but definitely with renewable energy as a priority. The other key thing that it also talks about is on aspects of minerals and green industrialization. As you all know, close to 40% of global green minerals are available in the African continent. And therefore, they really launched what they call Africa's Green Mineral Strategy. They talked about issues on local beneficiation, value chains, and green industrial clusters, which I think was very, very key. So that we can make sure that especially local communities that are living close to these minerals are benefiting from the same and not necessarily being exploited. And then they also spoke very strongly on aspects of transparency and environmental governance on the green minerals themselves. The other thing that was really, I think, original and something that we should all be happy about on the declaration is that it also talked about things that sometimes we don't necessarily connect with climate. And these are things like food and agriculture, as well as health, among other things. So on food, they were very clear that they were committing to a climate resilient agriculture, food sovereignty, and ending hunger. And they actually talked about anchoring adaptation finance in the national budgets, and also really talked about prioritization of smallholder farmers, women, and youth, especially on issues to do with seeds, irrigation, and insurance, which I thought was really, really groundbreaking in terms of them connecting climate with key issues like food sovereignty and agriculture. And then the other two things I will mention is that on adaptation and resilience, I really clapped for our African representatives when they actually mentioned that for Africa, the foremost priority is on adaptation. They mentioned about adaptation, it has to be on all sectors, especially those specifically affected by climate, aspects like water, food, energy, cities, health, and ecosystems. I think that was really, really good. And then it also talked about how to include the local and scaling up local solutions and indigenous solutions. I thought that was really, really good. And then the other bit on health, it definitely spent some time to make a causal link between health and climate, or climate and health, sorry, including aspects like heat waves, water scarcity, diseases, among others. And then they also called for a dedicated finance for health resilience, and endorsed the Belém Health Action Plan. And perhaps to finish, I will only mention that on a new thing that came out also was the connection between climate, peace, and security in terms of how the climate crisis can affect peace and security across the African continent. Now, all these are really, really good and something I really support. And perhaps the place I will stop before handing over is that the other significant shift that they've had is that in Nairobi, they had agreed that they will be meeting after every 2 years. But now in Addis, they've changed that. Now they will be meeting after every 3 years. So the next Africa Climate Summit, the third one, will be in 2028. Handing over back to you, Richard.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Omar.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Omar. Thank you for this presentation. It shows how
Vous faites objet dans vos présentations.
brilliant you are when you make a presentation, because where Mrs. Raj stopped, it's from there that you started, and you added the fact that you insisted on the situation of Africa towards energy like electricity. And today we have some ambitions within the framework of these summits in order for Africa to to have access to 20% of the energy in order to be competitive at the global level. We also have health issues that were also mentioned in your presentation. We have water scarcity. And regarding the problems, the health problems that you mentioned, we have some resolutions that were also taken compared to what was decided in Kenya, Nairobi, what meeting will be held at that period. We should try to take into account all the elements, and you also mentioned the access to funds or to funding, and you said it's important for many people. I think it's a good thing. This being said, we will now give the floor to Madame Adek. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Richard and Omar and Raj. I just add to what has been discussed, and especially I come here to just share what we think as women and vulnerable groups in terms of the outcome of the summit. So allow me first to look at, in terms of participation, I think there were few women, youth, and vulnerable groups who are represented in the summit. For example, we've had instances where we could get data from the Conference of Parties, and many times most of the Conference of Parties would have 36 to 37% representation of these groups. I think in future it would be good to know how many women and vulnerable groups were represented in these summits. But also in terms of organization participation in the side events, I mean, the cost of side events were a bit high, even for these women to get represented. We are talking about $1,300. I mean, the side events. Pavilions were equally very expensive. I think they were going to up to $30,000 per pavilion. But we were lucky as women groups to be supported by UN Women to have our events in their pavilion. But I want to talk about, in terms of declaration, has been mentioned in terms of the good side, but I want to just give a brief or an overview, looking at it from the women's perspective. And going back to Richard's second question on what was the general view in terms of the declaration. And I'm looking at, the declaration also ensure that we recognize the initiatives that other African initiatives that are going on, like the energy initiative, the agriculture initiative, among that. So I think the declaration really, didn't leave initiatives, frameworks that are already ongoing, and that was a good thing, that we recognize that the other frameworks, like the African Agenda of 2063, the Sustainable Development Goals, and among other initiatives that the African countries are partaking. So that was a good thing, that we recognize that the other frameworks that are ongoing. So in terms of climate change and gender, I would go and just pick up on a few issues. In the preamble, I think there was recognition that this declaration is being developed by other than the states. It's also recognized the different groups, including youth, women, and communities, which was a good thing. I think the declaration also recognized that Africans are not just victims, but we are also solutions to climate disasters. But also, it took stock of the resources that the African countries have, including the forest and all that, the energy, which was also a good thing. But let's talk about the climate finance, and I think Raj mentioned a lot, and also Omar, about climate finance. When you're talking about the need for the 3 trillion required by 2030, I think in future it's good also to see how much of these finances go to women. We need to deliberate further and say, from this is how much the vulnerable groups requires. As we speak, we know it's only 2% of the climate finance that goes to women and women groups. We've not even talked about the indigenous groups and the people with disability, among others. So in future, it's good to go further and say this is how much we need for the vulnerable groups. And of course, insisting on grants and not loans. On the energy access, I know that the target for the 300 million population is a welcome, given that women are the big stakeholders when it comes to energy access and renewable energy. On the agenda, on the declaration on the just transition, I think there's also need to recognize the place of the vulnerable groups in the just transition outcome. I think that was not mentioned. It was very general. We also welcome the component on the green transition of minerals. I think that is something that has not been dealt with a lot from previous declaration. But let's look at the food and agriculture component. As we speak, I know 60 to 70% of the workforce in the agriculture sector is women-led. So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of supporting these groups, especially the vulnerable groups. So we welcome the fact that there was emphasis on means of implementation in the agriculture sector, looking at finance, looking at technology, and looking at capacity building. And the call also for direct granting to support these smallholder farmers, which most of them are women and the vulnerable groups. I think there was a mention of ensuring benefit sharing and transparency and accountability when it comes to carbon markets and nature-based solutions. I don't want to go to the controversies of those subjects, but I think the fact that those groups were recognized in terms of benefit sharing and distribution of benefits and all that, I think that was welcome. In terms of technology-based solution, I think there was a mention of inclusive technology-based solution when it comes to early warning systems, agriculture, water management, and health systems. in adaptation. I know the critical role of youth, women, and children was also recognized in the adaptation component. I would also echo what Omar said in terms of climate-induced mobility. The introduction of the peace, security, and the climate-induced mobility, which was not there before, except there was no reference also to the vulnerable groups. And lastly, the health component is welcome, given that there is a big link within the sexual reproductive health rights and climate justice as well. But I want to conclude by saying I think there's need to put more emphasis on putting women and vulnerable groups into the decision-making tables, especially during these summits. Financing a lot in terms of accessibility for African women and vulnerable groups in terms of climate finance, and also changing the narrative that women are not able to manage finance, especially climate finance, changing the narrative that women can also manage this climate finance. And lastly, recognizing the role or the place of unpaid care work, where most of the women are putting a lot of their time on areas of searching for water, food, and taking care of the vulnerable groups, and not getting involved in climate action. Thank you, and over to you, Richard.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Anne, pour aussi
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Anne, for your brilliant exposé.
Vos prédécesseurs, Madame Raj,
which is completing the presentations of the previous speakers, Madame Raj, Mr. Omar, and you are all insisting on access to funding by vulnerable groups, especially indigenous people, women, and for the health aspect, that issue should also be taken into account. You tried to underscore some outcomes that are encouraging and regarding new technologies. You talked about some capacity building and the fact that indigenous people should have access to funds, should have a better access to funds, to capacity building. So this is to better understand the decisions that are made regarding the climate change, and these vulnerable groups are the main of the first victims. Thank you very much. So now we are going to give the floor to Dr. Ahmad before giving the floor later on to Madame Maxine. We are going to change a bit, so I will take the gender aspect into account. So, Dr. Ahmad, you have the floor, please.
Thanks a lot. Actually, I echo what my colleagues have said. I don't have a lot to add, but I actually want to speak more about the lived realities of the people. The declaration was good, and the outcomes of the Addis summit was good, but at the end of the day, there is a risk of what we call green resource curse. We are rushing through just transition, but we should ensure that this transition is just. And we have seen that the global demand for transition minerals required for renewable energy infrastructure is driving a new wave of extractive activity across Africa that is, if left unchecked, I think this can lead to a green resource curse. And we see again a cycle of human rights violation, and we have seen this. There is always a risk and some cases of land dispossession. where communities and indigenous people face displacement without adequate compensation, violating the rights to property. And we have seen as well environmental pollution, where mining activities has led to severe water contamination and air pollution and ecosystem destruction, infringing upon the fundamental rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. We have seen in some cases violence, where environmental defenders and journalists and community leaders who protest against destructive projects, they face targeted violence and slaps, the strategic lawsuits against public participation, and harassment from private sector as well. So I think to truly protect the vulnerable communities, the just transition agenda must be implemented with some what I call non-negotiable legal and procedural safeguards. The free, pride, and informed consent. We should ensure that governments and corporates secure free, pride, and informed consent of indigenous peoples and local communities before initiating any project impacting their lands. We believe that communities must not be consulted at the margins, but meaningfully involved in planning and monitoring. At the end of the day, those who are most affected by climate change and extractives should not be the last to know, but the first to decide. I think the second pillar is access to justice and remedy, which needs strengthening of the legal and institutional framework to allow the victims of environmental harm to seek effective and timely judicial and non-judicial remedies against states and maybe multinational corporations, and protection of environmental defenders and indigenous people. And actually, this is the essence of ERA. I briefly introduced Environmental Rights Africa at the beginning of this session, but ERA is a Pan-African coalition of civil society organizations. And I believe it's more of a movement of communities and defenders. And we are exploring pathways towards a continent-wide agreement on environmental rights crafted by Africans and for Africa that is built on 5 key pillars: access to environmental information, public participation, consultation, and access to justice and remedies, protection of environmental defenders, and protection of indigenous people and vulnerable groups. And we believe that ERA can help safeguard and fill the gaps in the implementation of the commitments in the declaration and in any environmental work. But I think more than this, we should know ourselves first. We should know the reality of environmental rights in our continent. And I see a lack of knowledge here. So I wonder, like, if people can raise their hands, how many people know anything about the Zagora terrorist protests in Morocco, or, for example, I'm not a landfill movement in Tunisia. And even Derna, I don't know if people know about Derna or not, but Derna was a climate change catastrophe in Libya, where the torrential rains has swept 2 dams, and more than, estimates from 4,000 to 11,000 people were dead as a consequence of this, because these dams, hasn't been designed for the consequences of climate change, and of course there is lack of adaptation, and they just collapsed. And I wonder how many of the participants here who are interested in climate change and environmental justice know about such cases. So I think it's time to know each other better and to know our continent better. And I think this can lead us to really putting sound policies that can be realities on the ground and not just aspirational. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, docteur Abdallah, pour
Thank
aussi votre
you, Dr.
intervention
Abdallah.
vraiment hallucinante. Vous avez apporté
So
beaucoup
you
d'éléments qui nous édifient
brought many important
et vous nous
elements in
exhortez
your presentation,
à
and you
chercher à
urge
savoir
us
ce qui se passe
to
ailleurs, comme
try
vous
to
venez
understand
de donner
and to see
l'exemple
what
de la
happens
Libye,
elsewhere. You
où il y a
took the
eu
example
vraiment
of
des
Libya,
victimes
where
des
you
conséquences
had we had
environnementales.
some
Après,
environmental
au niveau de
issues in
l'Afrique,
order
de mettre
to
pied
also
des
at the
instruments
level
juridiques
of
qui
Africa to
reflètent la diversité
implement
de toute
some
l'Afrique, mais
juridic
non de mener
legal
cette lutte contre,
instrument in order to
ou bien de
fight
mener cette lutte
against
climatique à
uh,
l'isolé ou à l'interne
climate
seulement,
change,
puisque les sommets, ça regroupait
because the
tous les
summit
États
uh,
africains et
gathered
ceux qui y ont participé.
many states from West
Et vous
Africa.
avez souligné
You
aussi
also
qu'on ne
highlighted
doit pas prendre
the
des
fact that
mesures
we should not,
où on n'implique pas les autochtones, les personnes
I mean,
vulnérables,
you
les
stress the fact
populations
that we
vulnérables,
don't
et même on doit
uh,
savoir impliquer les
really
gendarmes
take into
parce
account
que ils ont
uh,
droit à être pris en charge.
vulnerable people,
Et
vulnerable
aussi,
communities. They
on
have the
doit
right to
vraiment
be taken into
veiller
account, and
à la
we should also
protection des victimes
make
des
sure
dégâts
the victimes of
environnementaux et surtout des
environmental
défenseurs
hazards are
environnementaux parce que
also
quand les
uh,
défenseurs environnementaux montent au
taken
créneau,
into account,
on les
because
arrête, il y a des arrestations arbitraires. Ça, c'est presque partout en
most
Afrique. Ça
often
dépend des
they
personnes.
are
Quand on veut
kind of
faire
harassed
des extractions minières,
when we want maybe
on ne tient
to
pas
carry
compte
out
des
some
impacts environnementaux,
extractions
c'est à quoi
activities.
on
We don't
donne
take
des
into
gains
account
publics. Et donc, on veut prendre
the
des
environment, and
métaux ou des énergies renouvelables, mais on ne tient pas compte qu'il y a des populations qu'on est en
we
train de
don't
déplacer, on est en train
bear
de
in
mettre
mind the fact that we have
à
some
pied, on bafoue les cultures
population
des gens, y
or some
compris
people living
les autochtones de leur
living
lignée
there.
naturelle.
And
En tout cas, merci pour ces révélations et surtout
thank you
pour
for this
souligner
presentation, and
à quoi on doit s'en tenir pour
we
essayer
already
de
know
corriger
now
tout cela qui
what
contribue
should be taken into
à un
account
bon
in order
environnement.
to
Notamment, on a parlé de
environment.
justice,
You talked
la
about
protection des
justice,
défenseurs
the protection
environnementaux
of
et la protection de
environmental
l'homme.
activists,
Merci
the
beaucoup
protection of
pour ces éléments
indigenous people.
enrichissants. Sans
Thank you
pourtant
so much for
tarder,
this
nous accordons la parole à
important
Madame
elements. Now we are going to give the floor
Madame,
to
vous
Madame
avez
Maxilienne Boyo.
la parole
Madam, you have the
pour
floor.
votre présentation.
Kindly share your presentation with us.
Thank you so much, Richard. And it's really nice to see a couple of people on the panel that I was together with at the summit. So it's nice to hear from Ahmed. And also, I think I really do agree with some of his sentiments with respect to ensuring that justice is at the center of some of the discussions that we have. So the summit should be more than just making speeches and a platform for connecting with other civil society organizations and then going back home and acting like nothing happened. I think it should really be about ensuring that outside of the declarations, they're actually binding obligations that are placed, but also on different commercial actors, and that there are mechanisms that can be used in order to ensure that they act in a manner that is in alignment with some of the declarations that are obviously made at this kind of platform. So I've been asked to talk today about the role of courts and legal accountability in climate governance, and also to reflect a little bit about whether or not certain legal processes that have been happening globally that have been influencing environmental and climate protection had any sort of impact on the summit and some of the outcomes that came out of the summit. And I think before I have any discussion about the role of courts, I think it's important for us to understand, to really pause and remind ourselves what the purpose of courts is in the first place. And I think at the core of it, courts are supposed to be a beacon of justice in different types of democratic societies. So they're not only supposed to be used as these platforms for dispute resolution between different private actors, but instead, I think vehicles to allow for the upholding of the rule of law, to give meaningful, I I think, statements and judicial decisions when it comes to constitutionally protected rights, to allow for the creation of accountability, to bring legal certainty, which are all really critical concerns when it comes to dealing with something as complex and as urgent as climate change. And in Africa, we've really seen how different types of courts in different jurisdictions are stepping into that space. If you look at South Africa, for example, we've just had the Shell case being heard at the Constitutional Court, which is a case where different fishing communities came together, being supported by civil society organizations, and took Shell to court in order to stop seismic blasting off of the Wild Coast, which was going to impact their daily lives, impact marine life. And I think that decision really sets a precedent for all of us. It helps us to acknowledge how courts are able sometimes to balance really competing interests, instances where they have to defend people and the environment, but on the other hand, they've got external pressures, probably from state actors or from commercial entities. Kenya is also, I think, a really useful example of a country on the continent whose judicial system is also trying to make inroads when it comes to promoting accountability. I think Kenya has just had its first ever case dealing with carbon market projects. So there's been a challenge against specific carbon market projects in that country, which has raised really serious concerns about issues of fairness and participation, and asked questions as well around whether community rights are being protected in some of these emerging carbon trading schemes on the continent. And I think these cases really highlight for us how courts can act as vehicles to advance climate justice and to demand accountability, as well as to make sure that both governments and companies align with constitutional and human rights obligations. But I think it's also important for us to be realistic as well. So courts have their limitations. In a lot of different African countries, access to justice can be something that's really difficult for a variety of different reasons. Resources is one of the top reasons. Resources are always limited sometimes for litigation. A lack of independence when it comes to the judicial system is also a growing concern in different different jurisdictions. Institutional capture is also a concern in other jurisdictions, and this places hurdles when it comes to the achievement of the realization then of the goal of accountability. So I think the short answer is that courts alone won't be able to solve the crisis, but I think it's important to note that they're also very indispensable. They help to set certain standards in different countries, they help to create accountability, and in instances where they're being utilized with other different mechanisms, for instance, in instances where certain communities are empowered to speak out, I think those communities can also be a powerful tool to demand justice that specific communities deserve. And then when it comes to the question of whether or not the summit reflected on some of the more important ongoing legal processes happening globally, and here, what comes to mind is the ICJ advisory opinion process in particular, but we also know, of course, that there's this very current ongoing petition that's happening before the African court that also deals with an advisory opinion process, asking the court various questions that are related to state obligations with respect to the consequences of climate change that Ahmed so aptly articulated earlier on. What are the duties necessarily of states in instances where there's a flooding event, where there's fires, where there's drought activity that causes civil unrest, that causes food insecurity? All those are things that the African court has to flesh out for itself. But the ICJ has had its own process that has recently been concluded. And I think I've got very mixed feelings here. I think on one hand, in the lead up to the summit, there were a lot of different African states that were acknowledging the landmark decision coming out of the International Court, and also civil society organizations, I think, did the same. But then on the other hand, I think at the actual summit, there was a lack of an uptake. there appeared to be very lone speeches here and there that reference the ICJAO, and in a couple of lone panels, maybe there was also discussion about it. But I think there's been much less evidence of state level policy changes or any type of pledges that explicitly were anchored in the advisory opinions, legal findings. So I think in many cases, if you read the declaration, it highlights the fact that, and I think that's normal. Also, litigation generally, legal processes generally, are thought of as being contentious things, and so, in the spirit of being diplomatic, that's maybe why these types of subject areas were sort of avoided. But I think there's a strong gap then between actually having instances where the outputs acknowledge certain legal duties and then translate them into revised policy, revised law, and actual enforceable regulations, or even concrete budget allocations. And then when it comes to what we actually can do, and I'm looking at the time, I don't want to take too much time away from you, Richard. I know we have to close in 3 minutes, but I think looking at what we can do as different African states to help at least our different judicial systems, communities, societies to take up some of the principles that were highlighted in these other legal processes that have been happening is various things. I'll only mention two. The first one is the fact that we have to strengthen judicial capacity and access to justice. It really doesn't matter what the AO says about due diligence, what it says about the rights of future generations, what it says about, what constitutes a wrongful act in international law or not. If the judicial systems that we have are broken, if they're under-resourced, if they're subject to manipulation and external control, that won't matter, because at the end of the day, the rule of law in those instances is undermined. So I think we have to look into bolstering the independence of our institutions and also strengthening institutional capacity. And then something else that a number of different civil society organizations are already doing is enthusiastically trying to extract some of the principles that have been inculcated in the court's judgment and sharing them then with different civil society organizations in different African jurisdictions so that they can use them at a domestic level and a regional level at different courts, especially some of the confirmations that came out on fossil fuel related subsidies, on emissions regulation, on the issues of loss and damage. These are likely going to be principles that are going to change the nature and aggressiveness of legal action in the sphere of environmental and climate justice. So I think all in all, the summit was a successful one. And I think it is an opportunity for Africa to ensure that it's not left out of the discourse of what is a very important and urgent matter in the globe, which is primarily to safeguard the rights of its people and also to safeguard the environment itself. Thank you so much, Richard, and back to you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Asiemoyo.
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Moyo, for this presentation. You came back on the role of court and the legal system in the world and at the environmental level to give the role of the court in general. And for the environment, you laid an emphasis on access to justice, environmental justice by indigenous people, capacity building.
Les animateurs de nos juridictions doivent être outillés sur les questions climatiques, sur la justice climatique, bien
We
sûr.
should focus on issues related to climate change.
Ayant trait aux violations climatiques dont les autochtones ou les
So All these aspects should be taken into account, especially for the various victims. They need to be ready. So you also insisted on the autonomy of our institutions. Our institutions should be independent in order to make the right decisions. You also mentioned the implication of the civil society, which is this participation is more holistic because this is what was mentioned. We want to include everyone. And you finished by saying that the summit, the Addis
So
Ababa
you said
summit,
that
was
the
a
Addis
success.
Ababa success was a success and a good opportunity for Africa. And Africans should implement all the decisions and resolutions taken during this summit. Dear panelists, you were wonderful and very you went to the point. Your presentation were very interesting. So thank you so much. So now we are going to open the debate because time is limited. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Maybe we'll take 2 or 3 questions because already I am told that we have reached the end of our meeting. So just take few questions, 2 or 3 questions, to enable the participants interact. If you have any question, just raise your hand and then we'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Richard. In the meantime, let me just read the Q&A in the Q&A section, and then the panelists can respond if that is okay. So we have Sasa Emmanuel James, who is saying that in the summit, is there any commitment by our 54 country presidents to contribute towards African Climate Summit in future? Or are we waiting for development countries, international banks to contribute for the African Climate Summit? I think maybe one of the panelists or Rajneesh, you can respond to that. Also, he asked another question. In negotiation at the COP28, 29 respectively, demand capacity building, institution development, transparency, accountability, especially global South countries. What solution should African leaders did African leaders come up with to address the challenges so that investments, donors can invest in African climate change in future? I think any of the panelists can take this. And Flora Chebet is also asking, she's saying, thank you for the great presentation from the panelists. What strategies exist to ensure that Africa's unified positions at COP30 are legally binding and enforceable and not just political declarations? I think this is such an interesting question. No, Masango, I would like maybe you could take that on. Emmanuel again is saying investment in technology like AI and advanced technologies. Our panelists have talked about it in regarding African Climate Summit. Also, Omar has left after his very good intervention. Thank you for his engagement. I also see another comment on the chat by Christosom, who's saying that my suggestion is to develop strategies in order to have specialized courts in environmental litigation and to develop strategic litigation. As lawyers, we have to play an important role. Thank you for that. Ridhiwani Sadiq is also saying Kenya has a lot of minerals, but the people at the mining areas are very poor. So how do we intervene? Maybe one of the panelists can take that on. So due to the limitation in time, maybe we can have the panelists respond to the questions and then give your closing remarks. So we start with Rajneesh.
Thanks a lot, June. And maybe just to the very first question, the African Climate Summit is actually done by a country, so it's hosted by one particular government, and then they are the ones, or their ministry, and they are the ones necessarily responsible. And I think when we're talking about Ethiopia also trying to put in a bid to host, perhaps I think COP32, then it's not funding that's coming from multilateral development banks or African countries. It's that particular country that has to gather the funding for it and ask for support. So I don't necessarily think in the declaration anything like that is necessarily put out. It's more on the individual country that wants to put out the bid. I'll respond also to maybe the question around investment in technology. So a couple of the things that came out from the Africa Climate Summit, especially around the Africa Climate Facility, is around research in AI. And part of it is financing for the future in terms of understanding there'll be accelerator funds to see if we can put out hackathons for the youth, especially if they're able to develop technologies that are sort of climate resilient. And I think that's why we were calling them technologies for Africans by Africans. So it might not be a very big fund, but it has been put aside. The only thing is, again, it's a pledge. I don't know if it will translate into funding, but there's a lot of different things like that that exist around the continent, and many countries are coming up with such interventions. And lastly, to the question around mining in Kenya, I think it's because even previously from my experience, yes, Kenya is endowed with a lot of natural resources. The challenge for us has been that the mining sector could contribute 10%, but currently is at 1%. Not that we don't have the right minerals or we don't have the right resources. It's more a challenge on governance and how we can ensure the sector actually attracts enough investment, and secondly, a lot of the artisanal miners are actually recognized within the country as contributors to the economy rather than just a one-off sort of exercise. In summary, for me, thanks a lot, everybody, again, for staying this long. All I'll say is beyond pledges and beyond numbers, we actually need to see actions that happen. And I think the question around ensuring unified positions at COP30 is probably the start. That we are at least showing unified positions as Africans, quite a lot of countries, but it's not going to translate into actually getting the right finance on the continent for the people if we are not pushing our governments to signing deals that are fair for us, and ensuring that we are holding them accountable and following up on any sort of pledges they make. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Merci. On ne sait pas s'il y a un
Thank
autre
you very much. I do not know whether there is another comment to the questions raised, dear panelists.
Yes, Richard, do you mind if I go next? Just because for the sake of time, I might have to jump off soon. But I'd like to start off with the question I think that was on the chat, dealing with the inclusion of specialized courts when it comes to some of our environmental litigation. I think that's a very, very good point. I think for some jurisdictions, specialized courts make a lot of sense. If you take Kenya, for instance, I know they've got specific tribunals that deal with land issues, that deal with environmental issues. And that helps a lot when you think about much more rural settings where people want to redress very quickly, but at a lower level, and that works very well. But then in other jurisdictions, there isn't necessarily a need for specialization, a specialized court to deal with some of these environmental issues. In other words, some courts already have the technical capacity to understand the complexities of environmental litigation, because environmental rights are so closely linked with other rights like the right to human dignity, the right to life, other constitutionally protected rights that are inculcated there in that specific framework are dealt with on a daily basis by high courts, by Supreme Courts of Appeal. So in jurisdictions like South Africa or Zimbabwe, for instance, there isn't necessarily a need for specialization, particularly when you think of specialization from the context of instances where maybe you're dealing with something that is so complex that it requires the role of a judge who's basically used to that subject area, to dealing with that subject area on a day-to-day basis. So if you think about competition law, for instance, that's an area of law that would require some level of specialization that a normal judge wouldn't have any access to because of exposure and because of the types of arguments that are made there that maybe have economic elements to them. But with environmental law, I don't think necessarily all jurisdictions require specialized courts in order to deal with some of the issues that arise out of environmental litigation. And then I think there was another question about COP and basically how to ensure that as much as possible there's alignment in terms of the positions that we have as a continent when we go to COP. I think something that may be a novel strategy to use is the fact that already Africa is segmented into some of these regional blocks. You've got SADC, you've got ECOWAS, the EAC. I think it would make a lot more sense to have some sort of galvanizing, caucusing initiatives uh, in instances where different blocks are able to share ideas about what it is that they think they agree on. I think that would go a much longer way into ensuring that there's more of a unifying factor when it comes to interacting at COP. And then also, I think coming up with different mechanisms to ensure that some of the actual outcomes that arise out of COP are stuck to. So what are the sanctions in instances when someone deviates from some of the things that we've discussed and agreed on? That hasn't been something that has been given enough thought and attention to. So I think that would be my response to that. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Palu, as well, and to your listeners. I have to jump off, unfortunately, but thank you so much for the opportunity.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We have reached the end of our meeting. The organizer is saying that we have gone beyond the time allotted. So I would like to thank Madame June Cynthia and all her team, all the team of the interpreters for enabling the communication during this webinar. It is the first of its kind from our Commission on Human Rights. And in Ethiopia, there were a lot of participants. We had 55 participants, and now some are leaving because of their own agenda. So I'd like to thank all the panelists. What we can retain here is that from the second summit, it was a success, and it was decided that henceforth the investment in terms of payment be done through Africans themselves. Countries took pledges, so they pledged to contribute to the funding. So we hope that this funding will benefit to everyone. There should be free access to everyone, the people living with disabilities, to fund native countries so that we implement all what was decided. We saw some gaps. Of course, the issue of gender was not fully taken into account. Also, people living with handicap, disabilities, they have been forgotten. And also the language was not very clear regarding the fossil energy fuels, even if some questions were debated. And there were resolutions, still a lot remained to be done. The most important thing is the commitment as said by my Mrs. Moyo, we should urge our governments to implement all their commitments. And when in Africa we go to COP, we should go with our own positions, which arises from the different blocks. So we are going to share all the resolutions of the second African Summit on Climate. I do not know, Dr. Ahmed, if you want to add something. Otherwise, we have reached the end of our webinar. I'll give back the mic to June Cynthia. Over to you, June Cynthia.
Thank you, Richard. I just want to give Ahmad and Anne the chance to give their closing remarks, and then we can close just in a few minutes, please. Please, Ahmad, and then Anne.
Thanks a lot, June, and thanks for Valo. I just have one thing to say. If there is one thing that the Africa Climate Summit has shown us, is that there is no single government and no single organization and no single region can navigate the climate crisis alone. And collaboration is not optional; it's a conditional. Is the condition for survival and the pathway to justice. So collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. And if Africa negotiates divided, we negotiate weak. So thank you so much, and over to you, June.
Thank you, Ahmed. Anne, Tech.
Thank you so much, June. For me, I would say the SES was an opportunity not just to address climate change issues, but to address issues facing the continent, especially on debts, the issues of critical minerals, peace and security, among others. So I think it's good to look at it broadly, and it can get better. I think looking forward to the third one. And I think we don't need to get to SCS before we make the decisions. Let's start planning now. I think there's need to invest a lot on data, especially in the African countries, and especially for the vulnerable groups. And lastly, issues of finance is key. We need to unlock the finance issue and ensure that these finance are accessible, and especially to the vulnerable groups. Thank you, June, and thank you, Richard, and everyone.
Merci, Anne. June,
thank you, Anne. Thank you, June. Thank you so much for organizing this webinar. The connection was perfect. I know that people work behind the scenes, like Adam and the others who work behind the scenes in the Secretariat. I would like to thank the Executive Board of PALU, and thank you for the opportunity provided to us to meet and exchange and share our information, to be well equipped and take up the climate challenge in Africa. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Richard. Goodbye, everyone. I've just posted my email on the chat. If you want to reach out, I'll share the recording. Thank you to everyone. Goodbye.